My daughter slid a thick folder across the walnut table as if it were a verdict. The first page bore a neat heading, Asset Transfer Authorization. "Sign it, Mother," she said, voice clipped and practiced. "If you don't, you'll lose everything and us." My name is Margaret Whitfield, 67, retired literature teacher, widow of Edward Whitfield. For 40 years, I stood just to the left of his ambition while he built a fortune the unglamorous way, patience, discipline, and stocks that paid us in seasons, not headlines. When he died last spring, his will gave full control of the portfolio to me. Graham Cole, our attorney, read it aloud. The bank confirmed it without blinking. It was all clear. But nothing felt clear in Charlotte's living room that night. The house was flawless steel glass and white surfaces that resisted fingerprints and feelings alike. Charlotte, my only child now an executive, rested her manicured finger on the signature line as a metronome of pressure. "You don't understand markets," she murmured. "I do. Let me take over and I'll make sure you're comfortable." I lifted the pen, felt its cool weight, and heard Edward in memory, not some grand speech, just his steady way of saying, "Make money serve your compass, not the other way around." The tip hovered. The person my daughter needed at that moment was a frightened woman. I was not her. I lowered the pen and pushed the folder back. No. Something shifted behind Charlotte's eyes, less hurt than calculation. She stood, gathered the folder, and said nothing more. I left before the silence could harden into something we could not undo. Rain stitched the streetlights on my drive home. The gate recognized my car, the front lock did not. The card reader flashed red access denied. I tried again once, twice, then simply stared at my own reflection in the dark glass, like a visitor who'd arrived at the wrong life. Instinct told me to call Charlotte and demand a reason. Habit told me what she would say. "This is for your own good. Stay somewhere else until you sign." I put the phone away. The rain crept down my sleeves, cold and bracing. In that unwelcome chill, another memory surfaced. Edward in the attic years ago, passing me a small brass key. "If you're ever pushed to the edges, go to the lake cottage," he'd said. "That door will always open for you." The key had lived in my purse so long it felt like part of the lining. I turned the car toward the highway. The wipers beat a fast, even rhythm. The world outside was storm and trees, and the occasional gas station, glowing like a ship in fog. On the passenger seat lay the gray scarf Edward bought on a winter anniversary. He'd joked it would keep me warm when he couldn't. I wrapped it tighter and kept driving. By the time I turned down the narrow road toward the water, the rain had softened. The lake appeared between the cedars like a sheet of dull silver, patient and immense. Gravel popped under the tires as I pulled in. I climbed the steps, set the key in the old lock, and felt it turn as if time itself had been waiting for the sound. The door opened to cedar and quiet. The lamp near the window still worked. Its yellow circle of light felt like a small, stubborn hearth. I left my wet coat by the door, breathed in the wood, and listened to the ordinary creaks. I'd nearly forgotten the floorboard near the stove, the window that sighed in a west wind. Standing there, I finally understood what the red letters on my own front door had tried to tell me. I wasn't only locked out of a house, I had been invited into a decision. I could sign fear into power, or I could choose a different map. I chose the map. This wasn't a victory. It was a boundary, the kind that doesn't shout but holds. I wrapped the scarf closer, sat by the window, and watched the lake take the storm apart in patient ripples. Behind me, the cottage breathed. Ahead of me, a fight I hadn't asked for waited at dawn. Between those two truths, there was a steadiness I recognized as mine. The life I knew had ended at a red light. The life I needed began with a brass key. Morning at the lake did not arrive with trumpets. It came on soft feet, laying a pearl gray sheen across the water and coaxing steam from the old percolator on the stove. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the small sitting room, Edward's gray scarf looped once around my neck, listening to the cottage reacquaint itself with a living person, the kettle's sigh, the stove's tick, the polite creak of the floorboard near the window that always announced itself before you stepped on it. Peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of familiar noises. The cottage, bless it, still knew my name. I took my mug to the table beneath the east window and saw the envelope I had missed in last night's dimness. It lay partly tucked under a shallow bowl of smooth stones Edward collected on our walks. The paper was heavy rag cotton stock, the flap sealed with the kind of care that has nothing to prove. My name, Margaret, was written in his hand. No flourish, just those steady square letters I could have identified in a field of 1,000. I did not sit. I simply stood and opened it, letting the first sun of the day fall across his words. "If this finds you alone at the water," the letter began, "then a plan I hoped would remain unnecessary has become necessary. I have been accused of professorial caution my entire life. I consider it a compliment. Caution is stewardship for people you love." He listed 3 names each with a brief sentence like a compass heading. Graham Cole Law. You know him precise. Unafraid of silence, allergic to panic. Clara Hargreaves, bank. Trusts long math over quick math. Thomas Alderneighbor, former police, the quiet kind, who shows up before you ask. And then, you will be tempted to argue for your worthiness. Don't. Worthiness is a trap built by people who want your keys. Keep your keys. Keep your compass. Money is a servant, be a firm employer. I did sit then because my knees wanted to. Rain had scoured me clean the night before. The letter felt like a warm towel in an airport restroom. Unexpected mercy exactly when dignity needs a small assist. I folded it back along its crease and slid it into the cedar box on the shelf, then took it out again almost immediately, unwilling to let it disappear from sight. Edward had predicted a storm not because he was a prophet, but because he understood weather patterns in human beings. Charlotte loved velocity outcomes applause. She did not love waiting or limits. I dialed Graham first. He answered on the second ring with the voice of a man who believes in verbs. "I'm coming to you," he said after I summarized. "No offices. Bring nothing precarious. Make coffee if you like, black 2 sugars. Of course you like too much sugar," I said. Edward always did. Said it kept his nerves steady. "Then consider it tradition," he said, and hung up without wasting either of us on condolences or incredulity. Clara next. I had known her since she was a teller who counted boatmen's crumpled bills without making them feel smaller for bringing them in that way. She rose through the bank by honoring arithmetic as if it were a character trait. When I told her about the red letters on my own lock, she exhaled through her nose the way she does when she chooses words that won't light anything on fire. "Your accounts are titled solely to you," she said. "We'll add an alert to flag any inquiry or attempted transfer that isn't you in person. I'll call the custodian and place a notation of explicit retention of authority. If anyone tries to play fast, I'll make them read the will aloud until they stop breathing." "Can I stop by?" "You may," I said. "There's always too much coffee." Thomas, finally. The man had the quiet posture of a lighthouse, does not pursue attention, refuses to move, saves more than he'll ever count. He listened without interrupting once. "I'll bring a new deadbolt," he said, "and a whistle for you to humor me." I could hear him smiling. "Don't argue, Mrs. Whitfield. People who never needed protection often don't know when it's time to accept it." "Margaret," I said, "please, if we're to fight a war together, drop the Mrs." "Margaret," he corrected, and it fit. By mid-morning, the cottage had the hum of a room where something serious but not tragic is happening. Papers fanned across the table, coffee cups nested among manila folders, the scent of cedar and ink. Graham wore the same slate suit he'd worn to read Edward's will. He cared for his suits like he cared for sentences. Clara placed 3 binders side-by-side ports in a sea of panic for people who needed a harbor. Thomas changed the back door lock, tested the windows, and set a pea-sized brass whistle on the edge of the table, as if it were a charm a grandmother might sew into a hem. Graham's strategy was not elaborate, which is why it would work. "We catalog what exists," he said, tapping a legal pad. "We clarify intent, Edward's, and now yours. We harden the perimeter, title alerts physical space. We prepare for 2 likely moves, a pressure visit, and if that fails, a petition for temporary conservatorship. We do all of this without theater. The law hates theater. The town loves it," Clara added dryly. "Unfortunately, the town does not issue court orders." I breathed easier, not because they promised a clean victory, only fools promise those, but because they each spoke a language I could trust, facts without sugarcoating, care without condescension. This is what a team is, I thought. Not people who agree with you, but people whose competence allows your heart to unclench. Around noon, gravel popped in the drive. The car outside was sleek and black in the way success brochures prefer. Charlotte did not knock. She strode in with a folder under her arm and a man in a navy suit pacing 2 steps behind her. The man wore a smile the way some men wear cologne, too much of it, too confident you'll be impressed. "Mother," Charlotte said, pausing when she clocked Graham, Clara, and Thomas, like pieces on a board she had not anticipated. "You've made this more complicated than necessary." "You brought help," I said, nodding toward navy suit. "This is Mr. Keene," she replied. "He's an advisor. We're here to finalize transfers so you can rest." "Mr. Keene," Graham said pleasantly, rising just enough to be polite without conceding territory. "Graham Cole, I represent Mrs. Margaret Whitfield. If there is to be a conversation about assets, it will be precise." Keene placed a glossy packet on the table as if unveiling a dessert. "Our concern is simple," he said. "A portfolio this size demands active management. Protracted grief can impair judgment. Consolidation under Miss Whitfield's, Charlotte's direction will protect long-term value." Clara opened her binder as if it were a chapel. "There is no evidence of impairment," she said evenly. "Monthly bills paid, taxes timely, principal untouched, distributions limited to defined basic needs. If protection is the goal, inaction would be safer than your plan." Thomas did not speak. He leaned in the doorway near the kitchen, arm folded, watching Mr. Keene the way a man who's handled too many domestic calls learns to watch for hands as much as words. Charlotte's jaw flexed. She looked at me, not them. "You don't understand any of this," she said softly, the tone that once won middle school debates and later executive board approvals. "You taught poems, Mother, not markets." "I taught children to read what was in front of them," I said, "including motive." Keene tried again. "Mrs. Whitfield, Margaret, if we delay market conditions may—" "The market has existed without me," I said. "It will continue to do so. My job is not to entertain it. It is to steward what my husband built." Something in my voice surprised even me, not volume, not bravado. "Wait." Sometimes age gives you a tone that does not ask permission to exist. Graham slid a copy of the will across the table. "Edward Whitfield's intent is controlling," he said. "He left his financial assets solely to his wife in language I could recite in my sleep. Any attempted transfer of authority without her consent will be challenged, aggressively." Charlotte's gaze flicked to the will like a cat checking a door. "It already knows is locked." "You're forcing me to escalate," she said. "I don't want to fight. I don't want a—" "You want compliance," I said. "That's different." Keene decided to be useful in the way only a man paid to escalate can be. "There are questions in town," he said smoothly. "About your stability, the move here at night, the sudden secrecy. Conservatorship is not a punishment. It's protection." "Protection for your fee," Clara murmured too low for a transcript loud enough for everyone to hear. Thomas lifted a small stack of papers he'd set aside. While Mr. Whitfield was alive, he said charges on a supplementary card were made for a Palm Springs weekend, a diamond bangle, and the initial payment on a certain black SUV. He didn't look at Charlotte when he said it. The refusal to meet her eyes was mercy's last form. Mr. Whitfield did not pursue reimbursement, but let's not pretend sacrifice where records say otherwise. Charlotte's cheeks colored, then went pale, then settled into a rigid calm. "This is all very theatrical," she said. "It doesn't change the reality that Mother isn't equipped to. Graham, she is equipped, and she is represented. If you persist in harassment or misrepresentation, we will respond in court." Keene gathered his folder so briskly the corners clicked. "We'll be in touch," he said, which is the sound a retreat makes when it's trying to memorize your furniture for a return. They left without slamming the door. That was Charlotte's courtesy. She kept bruises where strangers wouldn't see them. I stood very still until the gravel quieted, then sat because my legs had opinions. No one cheered. Graham marked a date on his legal pad. Clara closed her binder and slid it a fraction of an inch to square the edges. That tiny act of order soothed me more than any speech. Thomas walked the perimeter once more, then returned and pointed at the whistle. "Wear it," he said, "even if you believe you won't need it. People tend to make noise too late." When they were gone, the cottage returned to its quieter pulse. I washed cups as if soap and water could launder air. It turns out that victory measured properly is not an adrenaline spike. It is the slow untying of a knot you've been wearing around your breath. I dried the last mug, folded the towel exactly in thirds, the way Edward used to tease me for doing, and set it across the oven handle. Only then did I let my hands shake. That afternoon, I drove into town for milk and onions, the benign rituals by which a life proves to itself it is still a life. A woman near the tinned tomatoes looked at me the way one looks at a news headline, interested superior, relieved it is not her. By the time I reached the register, a clerk I'd known since he was a boy with a cowlick had adopted the smile people keep for widows and rumors. "Good to see you out, Mrs. Margaret," he said, almost correcting himself into kindness. "Good to be seen," I said. Seeing's half the job. He didn't know what I meant and didn't need to. Not all words are for the same ears. Outside, the wind came clean across the water and lifted the edge of my scarf. I had the thought one has in transitions that I had moved houses without moving anything, that my furniture now consisted of a key, a letter, 3 allies, and a spine that seemed to have remembered its original factory settings. Back at the cottage, I placed the milk in the icebox, the onions in the blue bowl by the stove, and the letter where I could touch it, if I woke in the night and required proof that foresight is a love language. The days that followed were not cinematic. They had the stubborn texture of work. Graham filed notices that I intended to keep full control and would contest any ex parte order. Clara instituted alerts that chimed her phone whenever anyone breathed near my accounts. Thomas showed up with a battery-powered motion light for the porch and a second whistle in case you loaned the first to the cat. I started a notebook, not because I'm sentimental about notebooks, though I am, but because memory is a fickle archivist during grief and conflict. Date, time, name, what was said, what I felt, what I did instead of what I felt. The last column saved me more than once. Charlotte's first counterattack was social. I heard it before I saw it, a friend who called with a voice that hovered over the word, concerned the way a bee hovers over a sugar packet. "People are saying it isn't like you," she began. which is the citizen's way of laundering gossip into public service. I thanked her for the update as if she were the Weather Channel and went about boiling potatoes for supper. In a small town, reputation travels faster than truth. Truth refuses to chase it. Graham's advice and my instinct was the same: live visibly, not loudly. Pay what you owe. Arrive where you said you'd be. Don't explain. Explanations feed the wrong dogs. On the third morning, a white SUV eased into the drive and stopped short of the porch as if the air itself might stain it. Charlotte remained inside phone at her ear, staring at the lake the way a person stares at a test they believe is beneath them and too difficult at once. She did not come to the door. After a minute, she backed out and rolled away as noiseless as a movie scene in which the engine's sound was removed to make room for a soundtrack. I watched until the cedars swallowed the last square inch of black paint. Grief and pride are cousins. They attend the same family reunions and dislike being in the same pictures. That afternoon, Claire came with a loaf of rye bread and the news that a note had been added to my primary brokerage file: do not accept instructions from anyone other than the account holder. Confirm identity in person if material movement is requested. She said it like a woman affixing a brace to a staircase. You cannot stop people from shaking the railing, she said, but you can keep the steps intact. I don't want Charlotte destroyed, I said, surprising myself with the urgency of it. I want her stopped from destroying. You are not the only parent who wants to win that particular war, Clara said. Most of us lose in the short term and pray for a truce in the long term. In the quiet that followed, the lake sent its small language through the open window, the lap and hush that had anchored our summers when Edward still rose at 5 to walk the dock and check for loose lines. I took the letter out once more, read the paragraph about not arguing for worthiness, and laughed sudden and soft. Edward had always detested contests with no judges. The first explicit threat when it came tried to wear silk. An email from an account I didn't recognize: in light of recent concerns about your capacity and safety at the cottage, we recommend a temporary assignment of oversight to ensure no exploitation occurs. The signature block named a small firm with large adjectives. I forwarded it to Graham, who replied with a single sentence: please do not engage. I will play with my food. I closed the laptop and went outside with a broom to clear the pine needles from the steps. Practical tasks are the secular sacraments of people who have been told they are losing their grip. The best way to prove you can button your blouse is to button it not to publish an essay on dexterity. Toward evening, Thomas appeared with a bag of oranges and a folded printout. He set the oranges on the counter like offerings and handed me the paper. It was a list of local resources, counselors, mediators, a clinic calendar, the number for a legal aid office, in case someone you love decides to love you in a way that requires a restraining order. I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. Plan for weather you hope doesn't arrive, he said, and you'll enjoy the sunshine more. We stood on the porch, eating orange segments in companionable silence, the juice sticking our fingers, the sky climbing from copper to bruise. I used to think strength was loud, I said, a kind of standing tall that made people step back. This feels like planting your feet and letting the storm spend itself around you. It is both, Thomas said. Sometimes you shout so the right people can find you. Sometimes you shut the door and drink your tea. After he left, I wrote in my notebook, today I did not argue. Today I tightened the hinge on the back door because it squeaked. Today I did not sign anything that would make tomorrow smaller than today. On the 5th day, Graham returned with a stack of documents and a look that said he would rather take a nap and would not. I've drafted letters to send if necessary, he said. If they petition for conservatorship, we oppose. If they smear, we do nothing. If they threaten, we document. If they trespass, we call Thomas and then the sheriff. You keep living. Let law do law. How do you stand the parts of your job that feel like watching people drown while discussing the shape of the water, I asked. I remember that rescue and adjudication are different verbs, he said, and I make sure my clients eat. He left a casserole, pasta, and sausage in a dish that wasn't his on my counter. I almost protested. I didn't. There is a grace to letting yourself be held up in boring ways. That night, sleep found me at the table with an open book I didn't read. I woke at some hour that belongs to fishermen and widows. The lamp still on the scarf slid to my lap like a cat. Outside the lake were stars like counterfeit coins and returned each one for store credit. I made tea. I opened Edward's letter again, not because the words had changed, but because I had a little. Courage does not feel like a drum most days. It feels like your own breath, regular as tide. At dawn, the cottage breathed with me. I set a frying pan on the stove, cracked 2 eggs, toasted rye, ate at the counter, standing. Before I washed the plate, I heard tires in the drive, slow, then careful, then still. A knock this time, 3 measured taps that belonged to neither Charlotte nor bravado. I opened the door. A woman stood with a leather portfolio and kind eyes that knew where courtrooms keep their chairs. Mrs. Margaret Whitfield, she said, extending a card. I'm Judge Linda Caro, retired. A friend of Graham's. He asked if I might stop by and explain plainly what courts like and do not like when families try to turn love into paper. I smiled in a way my face had not made for a while. Judge Caro, I said, stepping aside, we like plain here. We have more coffee than sense and we're using both. She laughed, and even the laugh obeyed the local zoning, not too loud, perfectly legal. We sat at the table where every necessary conversation of my life seems to end up. She spoke in paragraphs that respected time. Conservatorship is extraordinary, she said. Courts are allergic to it unless there's blood or fire. Pay your bills. Keep records. Be visible. Lose your temper on paper, never in private, rarely, and in public, not at all. I can manage 2 of the 3, I said. The 3rd will require intercessory prayer. Then give yourself intercessors, she said, nodding toward the cedar box where Edward's letter lay. You already have one. When she left, the house felt steadier, as if someone had adjusted its level with a carpenter's eye. The wind had shifted. The lake wrinkled itself into small applause. I wrote another line in my notebook: when they come with papers, meet them with records and breakfast. It sounded silly and true, and therefore useful. By evening, a thin fog climbed the shore and softened the cedars until they looked like sketches. I stood on the porch with the scarf tucked high, the brass key warm in my palm, because I'd been fiddling with it like a talisman. Behind me, the cottage light fell in a square on the floor, a bright, neat geometry of refuge. In front of me, the lake moved the way time moves when you stop begging it to hurry. A loon called Mournful Comic Holy. I answered nothing and felt answered anyway. I did not know what Charlotte would try next. I did not know how long the town would choose its favorite story over the quiet one that required fewer exclamation points. I did not know if I could bear another public scene without letting something ungenerous slip out and stain us both. But I knew what to do at dawn: boil water, butter, toast. Raid the ledger, pull on boots, keep records, return calls, and refuse to let my no be drafted for me in someone else's font. Before I slept, I lifted Edward's scarf from the chair and folded it along its old crease. Fabric remembers. So do bones. So do rooms. I set the scarf on the back of the chair, the letter in the cedar box, the whistle on the sill, where light could find it if I could not. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark long enough to let my eyes tell my fear that it had exaggerated. Then I went to bed, and the cottage went to bed with me, and the lake carried the night without commentary, as lakes do when asked to keep your secrets until morning. The town did not take sides with banners. It took sides with eyebrows. In the market aisle where the flower lives and marriages come apart, people performed a delicate theater of concern. They lowered their voices to say my name louder. They hovered on the word alone as though it were a diagnosis. A boy who used to need a step stool to reach the penny candy rang up my groceries with a smile that belonged on a sympathy card. I did not correct them. Explanations, Edward used to say, are treats you throw to hungry dogs that will only make them follow you farther. Instead, I kept the practical rhythm that makes a life bills paid before their due dates, porch swept in the morning, a pot of soup large enough to share with no announcement that I would. If I was to be judged, let it be on the steady arithmetic of days, not the volume of my grief. On the 3rd evening after Charlotte's visit with her advisor, the cottage gave me a gift it had been saving. I was looking for a pencil and found a leather notebook instead, the cover scuffed and the spine broken to the shape of Edward's hand. I carried it to the table and opened it with the reverence you give to anything that might still contain a person's voice. At first it was numbers. Tickers, dividend dates, a small cartoon of a whale he'd drawn in the margin beside a shipping company he never quite trusted. Then a page that changed the air in the room. Charlotte asked again about consolidating the portfolio. She wants to free the capital for property deals that glow hot and vanish quickly. She is not wrong that speed dazzles. She is wrong that speed is a virtue. Money can be taught patience. People often refuse the lesson. A later entry dated in the final year, I always imagined handing the ledger to her. That image helped me through the dull work, a daughter steady because I taught her to be. Then I heard her at lunch say she would sell the lot. Not rebalance, sell. Why should we wait decades for dividends when we can flip? She laughed. It is not only a plan that troubles me, it is the heat in her voice. Heat burns what it touches. Margaret keeps a cool flame. Let the flame that keeps the house warm be the one that keeps the accounts. I pressed my palm to the page as if that might close a distance maps cannot measure. He had not left me the portfolio because I was a consolation prize. He had left it because he trusted the temperature of my judgment. There is a kind of grief that clears a lens. Mine did. The next morning, an envelope appeared with the mail unfussy paper, a return address from the Harbor Road. Inside, a letter written in careful script. Mrs. Whitfield, last winter, when our boat sank in the inlet, we thought the house would go next. Clara told us about a quiet fund your husband had asked the bank to keep for emergencies. We didn't know he knew our name. We do now. That money replaced an engine, kept our mortgage whole, and saved our pride. We hear people talking. We thought you might need a different kind of talk. Thank you for keeping what he kept. The Larkin family. I set the letter beside Edward's notebook and stared at them both until the lake outside lost its edge to sunlight. 2 pieces of paper, 2 instructions: be steady for him and be steady for those who live downstream of your steadiness. That week, I called Clara and Graham back to the cottage and told them what I wanted: to build a small, boring fund with a compass. Dividends only, I said. Principal is a museum exhibit, look, don't touch. Uses are 2-fold scholarships for harbor families and emergency grants like the one Edward quietly started. No naming rights, no galas, no photos unless someone insists. Rules and an outside accountant, so nothing here depends on my mood. Clara smiled in the way accountants bless things. We can put it under a trust with bylaws that would make a lighthouse proud, she said. 3 trustees distributed authority annual report, short enough to read and long enough to deter the unserious. May I suggest 1 trustee who knows law and another who knows boats? Graham, I said, and someone from the pier. And if Judge Caro is willing to advise without taking on weight, she did not come here to carry all the better. We met the next afternoon at the small table by the east window. Clara with draft bylaws, Graham with a crisp trust document, Judge Linda Caro with a legal pencil and the steadiness of a clock. We argued amiably over commas because commas matter. We wrote into the rules the things people forget to say when they love an idea. What happens if someone tries to bend the mission toward their reflection? What happens if we run out of applicants? What happens if we drown in them? We decided applications should favor craft and caregiving as much as college marine mechanics, welders, nurses. Every harbor needs more hands that fix, Linda said, and more hands that steady. When it was done, we signed in blue ink because blue insists on being original. The Whitfield Harbor Fund existed. It had a bank account, a modest website that did not wink or scroll, and a tin box I labeled bus fare pencils and emergency chocolate. Word travels by unadorned roads when it comes from the right mouths. Within a month, 6 applications sat in a neat stack. Jacob Reyes wanted to study marine engines so he would never again watch the men on his dock lose weeks to a part no one could diagnose. Lila Moraes wrote about her grandmother's lonely death and the nurse whose hand turned down the room's volume to something like mercy. She wanted to be that hand. Ben Harrow's essay was half misspelled and wholly persuasive, the kind of honesty that understands a tool before it knows a word. A 10-year-old named June came with her older sister and a crayon drawing of a boat with "Thank you, Mr. Edward" across the hull in block letters that were also a prayer. We invited them to the cottage because a bank desk is a hard place to begin a soft thing. They sat on mismatched chairs and drank lemonade out of glasses that had belonged to my mother. I told them the story they had applied to join. My husband believed numbers should behave, I said. He trained them. I am here to make sure they keep that training. You are not charity. You are the point. You are the... When we handed out the first certificates, hands trembled. June climbed onto my lap without asking the right of the unselfconscious and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. I have never had a word both break and repair me at once." I hugged her until she wriggled away and began counting the shells on the windowsill as if they were scholarships we had not yet given. The town adjusted in increments. Some people do not trust good done quietly. They need the loudness to translate it. But the harbor has its own rumor mill, and it grinds toward truth if you feed it with names of boys who got tools, girls who got stethoscopes, families who kept houses. Mrs. Cooper from 3 doors down no longer performed surprise when she met me on the lane. At church, a woman who had practiced not seeing me for weeks put her hand on my shoulder in the way of neighbors who remember what they share. We planned no dedication, but a bench happened anyway. The pier committee pooled small coins and smaller bills and ordered a stone seat for the willow's shade. The engraving kept its hat on Edward Whitfield, husband, neighbor, steady hand. When they asked me to say something, I wrote nothing. I stood with the scarf around my shoulders and spoke until the wind agreed to help. My husband treated numbers like workers. He did not flirt with them or make them perform. He gave them shifts and demanded they show up on time. If you are here, it is because those shifts paid out. If you are here, it is because you too have worked. Let us continue. No applause followed. Silence did the good kind that settles like a quilt. A man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended the sun had startled him. It was on the far edge of that good silence that Charlotte found her voice again. The email arrived 3 days later, polished, bright, and somehow weightless. She wrote from an address associated with a new venture waterfront development, all glass renders and words like synergy trying to sell themselves as meaning. She proposed that we align the portfolio with her projects to unlock value and mend fences. It was the sort of sentence you write when you think people are fences. I answered exactly once, and exactly this. Thank you for thinking of me. I decline. I wish you well. Graham approved. Claire printed the email and slid it into a folder labeled Boundaries Kept. I slept that night with Edward's scarf pulled up and the peculiar relief that comes when a door you once rattled has finally learned how to stay shut. Charlotte's next move did not come by email. It came by coffee shop and cul-de-sac, by casual remarks that sprout like mushrooms and are just as interested in decay. She told people I was not myself a vague savagery that travels easily because it offers the listener the thrill of compassion without the effort. In the bakery line, two women performed the duet perfectly, so sad followed by so irresponsible, and looked at me the way one looks at a ship that has forgotten its anchor. I bought my bread and took it home and ate it with butter and the stubborn joy of people who refuse to let other mouths choose their taste. I did not chase the stories. I made better ones. The fund posted his first tiny report, 3 scholarships, 2 emergency grants, principal untouched fees, minimal enough to make a banker weep with relief. Jacob sent a photograph of a dismantled engine with the caption, "Gonna make her sing again." Lila emailed a line after her first clinic shift, "I thought I would be brave. It turned out I needed to be gentle first." Ben fixed a bent rail on the pier without asking permission and left a note that read, "Safer now." Summer arrived as if it had been waiting in the next room for us to get our paperwork done. The harbor fair strung itself along the shore, paper signs smoked fish teenagers learning how not to be shy. I baked lemon bars and pretended the recipe was complicated so I could feel useful. Charlotte came and did not wear her armor. For once she chose a white blouse and sneakers, and for once she did not edit the world with lipstick. She stood with me behind the table while people bought sugar as if they were buying permission to be children again. A boy with sunburn and the permanent squint of a fisherman's son slipped a $5 bill into the fund's jar and ran. Later, I found his sketch of a boat underneath for Mr. Whitfield, who fixed our latch when Dad was at sea. Charlotte traced the sketch with one finger the way you test a seam for strength. I didn't know she said too soft to be a performance. She did not say what she hadn't known. I did not require the list. For a handful of weeks, the water held. Charlotte called once to ask about a therapist I had mentioned months ago when other storms were breaking. She went. She did not report or confess, which is how you know a person may be getting better. They learn to choose their audience. Once she brought muffins to the cottage and left them on the counter with a note that said only for the kids. I allowed Hope to be a guest, not a resident. The envelope that tried to evict Hope came on a mild Tuesday in a messenger's hand. Heavy paper embossed crests the aromatic seriousness of money that wants to be a judge. I signed for it and opened it at the table without sitting down. Petition for temporary conservatorship. In Re Margaret Whitfield. The words were familiar because Graham had warned me the way a lighthouse warns without apology. Incapacity. Risk of dissipation. Vulnerability. A chorus of concern harmonized in a key I recognized as strategy. The petition cited reports and observations, none attributed all useful. It asked the court to give Charlotte authority over my decisions until such time as I could prove myself back to the person people preferred to imagine. I poured tea with hands that shook only a little. Then I called Graham. He answered as if he had been waiting in the next room. "It's here," I said. "I'll file our opposition today," he replied. "We'll keep this in daylight. Eat something with salt, Margaret. People forget salt." I called Clara. She said she'd tighten the alerts and prepare a packet that would bore a judge into mercy-paid bills, tax receipts, minutes of fund meetings, my ledger of days. I called Thomas. He said only, "I'll be there for the hearing." Bring the whistle anyway. Finally, I called Judge Caro, not for representation she would not offer, but for plain speech I needed like bread. "The court does not like being used as a family weapon," she said. "Bring facts. Bring calm. Bring your scarf if it helps you remember who you are in rooms that forget." After I hung up, I sat with the petition and the notebook and the Larkins letter spread in front of me like a 3-panel map. On one page, accusation dressed for church. On another, the reason a man had believed I could carry the weight. On the third, the proof that carrying mattered beyond my front door. I wrote a single sentence in my own notebook. "When they question your capacity, show them your capacity to love with rules." Then I made a sandwich, because salt, as Graham says, is not optional. I ate it on the porch while the lake pretended not to stare back at me with its infinite, unamazed patience. The willows moved their small green applause in a wind that had not read a single court document and did not care to. I wrapped the scarf tighter and let myself imagine for 2 minutes, timed by my old kitchen clock, what a room full of strangers would try to tell me about my own mind. Then I stopped imagining and washed my plate. Evening drew a line of gold along the far shore, then erased it. I put the petition in the cedar box beside Edward's letter, not to give them equal importance, but to make them argue quietly with each other while I slept. The cottage breathed the way a faithful thing does when it knows you cannot. I turned off the lamp. In the dark, I practiced saying my name the way I would say it under oath, not louder, only truer. The morning of the hearing arrived without drama, which is how I prefer my storms. I dressed in the navy dress I once wore to school board meetings, wrapped Edward's gray scarf twice around my neck, and slid the brass key into my pocket like a promise. Graham met me on the courthouse steps with a nod that carried the weight of sleep surrendered for briefs. Clara carried 2 binders and calm. Thomas stood a pace behind us, not a bodyguard exactly, more like ballast. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of lemon and old paper. Charlotte stood near the door with Mr. Keene and a second lawyer whose suit looked leased by the hour. She was immaculate as ever, but there was a tremor in her smile, the kind that comes when certainty is rented, not owned. We did not speak. We did not need to. Some conversations have already happened in the choices that brought you to a room. Judge Serena Hollis took the bench with a gaze that tidied the air. She invited Charlotte's counsel to speak first. He did at length and with the kind of polish that treats concern like a weapon incapacity risk of dissipation isolated at a remote cottage. He gestured toward the gallery, invoking community reports the way fishermen invoke the weather. Mr. Keene folded his hands like a man auditioning for integrity. Graham rose without hurry. He submitted exhibits in a stack that was not tall but unarguable: paid utilities tax receipts, itemized bank statements, fund bylaws signed in blue ink, minutes of meetings, the ledger I kept of days. Clara testified with the patience of arithmetic, explaining that principal remained untouched, distributions were narrow, and audited alerts guarded every account. Judge Hollis asked questions that preferred answers to performances. When opposing counsel complained of market volatility, she asked Mr. Keene to state his compensation if control transferred. The number he named performed its own cross-examination. I took the stand and told the truth plainly. No, I was not coerced. Yes, I understood the nature and value of the portfolio. No, my move to the cottage was not a symptom, it was a boundary. Yes, I paid my bills. I did not decorate my answers. The law does not need adjectives to stand. In the pew behind counsel, I spotted Judge Linda Caro, retired visitor friend, listening with the quiet attention of someone who still believes that rooms like this can heal as well as harm. Thomas remained near the door, a calm sentinel who seemed simply by breathing to keep the proceedings on a single steady keel. The ruling came before lunch. Petition denied. Judge Hollis's voice was clear enough to rinse the corners. This court finds no credible evidence of incapacity. Family conflict is not a legal basis to seize autonomy. The respondent's records demonstrate competence and prudence. Miss Whitfield, the court, will not be used to referee ambition. Counsel, you know better. Her gavel did not slam, it concluded. In the hallway, Charlotte faced me without the insulation of a script. You embarrass me, she said too softly to be theater. No, I answered. The facts embarrassed the story. Her jaw worked. Anger tried to rise and met its limit. For a second, the girl she once was flickered through the one who wanted to be told she had done well. I did not touch her. Boundaries are tender until they are tested. Then they must be stone. She turned away with a whisper that sounded like a vow to keep being wrong louder. Back at the cottage, we did not celebrate. We ate soup. Graham left a photocopy of the order on my table and circled the line, no evidence of incapacity, with a pen stroke that felt like a benediction. Clara shelved the binders. Thomas checked the porch light, and for reasons known only to former policemen and saints, replaced its battery anyway. When the door shut behind them, the cottage exhaled, and so did I. The town needed time to change its eyebrows. It did slowly. Mrs. Cooper began greeting me without a preface of pity. The clerk with the cowlick waved me ahead in line and pretended it was because I had fewer items. At church, a man pressed my hand and said, "Steady on which is rural, for I misjudged you and would prefer to apologize without a scene." I accepted the translation. Life resumed its deliberate arithmetic. Fund applications read at the table by the east window porch, swept tea at 4. Jacob sent a photo of an engine reassembled and a caption, "Sings again." Lila wrote after her first week of clinicals, I learned the kinds of quiet that help. Ben left a receipt on the pier railing for bolts he'd paid for himself, along with a note, "Safer now." The annual report arrived from the accountant with the line I pinned above the desk. Steady hands at the helm. Weeks later, Charlotte's appeared at dusk, alone and unarmored. No blazer, no heels, just a sweater, sneakers, and a weariness that made its own honesty. She stood on the porch as if asking the wood to vouch for her. I opened the door. We sat at the table with mugs we did not drink. I thought if I could take it, she said, I could fix what I broke. She looked at her hands. I am learning the difference between control and repair. I won't hand you the portfolio, I said. Not because you are unlovable, because love without limits is weather, and weather ruins houses. She nodded a small motion that cost her pride. What can you give then? Things that don't drown either of us, I said. A referral to the counselor who taught your nightmares to blink. 3 sessions with Clara on boring money. 2 weeks in the spare room if you need to step away from your life to see it. And breakfast if you arrive early enough to want it. It isn't much, she whispered, and then softer, but it might be enough. It was not a miracle. It was a start. Some days she came in alphabetized files for the fund with the fervor of a penitent organizing sins. Some days she didn't come at all. Once she brought muffins and left them on the counter with a note for the students. Hope learned to occupy a chair without demanding the head of the table. Summer leaned in. The harbor fair made its cheerful mess along the water. I sold lemon bars that vanished faster than judgment. A boy with salt-burned cheeks slid a $5 bill into our jar and disappeared. His sketch of a boat I found later under the tin of bus fare. Charlotte stood beside me, sleeves rolled unnamed in a good way. We spoke little. We worked. Sometimes reconciliation is not a speech. It is a shared task, done honestly. At night, when the wind pressed the willows into their soft applause, I sat by the window with the cedar box open, the court order, the Larkin's letter. Edward's note, a child's drawing the accountant's precise comfort. I touched each paper the way one touches seawalls, testing for give, grateful for stone. The scarf stayed on its hook like a flag that had earned its rest. The key warmed in my palm as if metal could remember. I do not know the ending. That is not new. Endings were always rumors. I know this, the lake keeps its promises one ripple at a time. The fund will pay out on Fridays whether anyone applauds or not. Charlotte and I are 2 points on the same shore practicing how to wave without pretending the water between us isn't real. And I, Margaret Whitfield, keep the helm not to conquer seas, but to see that everyone who must cross has a boat that floats. Steady on. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.